I'm really excited to be here because the title of this conference, Knowledge Gap, is something I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about and working in, being in the education industry. And there's a lot of crossovers between how we think about knowledge gaps in education into what I see as some really big fundamental sources of problems that are, I think, a step before the majority of the people in this group who are actually working with data modeling and data architecture. And this is something I'm excited to talk about. Excuse me. So this presentation is doing more with less, and it's about the fundamentals in data and strategy that are effectively causing preventable waste. And it starts simply at the managerial, senior leadership, C-level, and it permeates down throughout the organization. This is from a Forbes article. Basically, it was saying, like, this is shocking. 71% of managers are not aligned with leadership, and this is pretty much ubiquitous as I've been consulting. Is the deeper down you go, you just start to see this drift of alignment. And I've been really interested in how does this impact organizations from a data perspective. So when we get down to the data level, that's where, we can say the rubber hits the road. And so I really like this person's kind of description of what is hard with data, like having, what does the number 3 in a status column mean? How and why are these different queries formed? Which tables contain the data you need? And there's this disconnect. Even if you align leaders at the top, that doesn't mean your data is aligned. And so the results of all this is we have huge amounts of time. My estimate, non-scientific, is it's up to 50% of data teams' time is just dealing with this problem. So for example, I spent about a year researching pain points of data teams, and it was just horror stories. Just a true lack of caring about the experience of data teams. So for example, you go into some data swamp, you have thousands of CSVs, none of the columns have any kind of description what they mean. The word revenue for a sales team can mean something totally different than the word revenue in an accounting team, right? One wants commission as part of revenue, the other doesn't. And this one word, which is a common word, right? So we typically will have semantics trying to manage these kinds of problems. But the ability to have the ability to care about the experience of the data person, the idea that they have to spend, sometimes weeks trying to find out who they talk to, and then they have to set up a meeting, and then they have to try and parse out of this meeting. Maybe the person doesn't work there anymore. What do they mean by this one word? And I'm not sure technology is going to solve this. I think certainly can help, but I think a lot of this has to do with education and culture. So I call this the problem with problems. And typically when I go into a consulting engagement, clients will want to solve these symptoms that they have. And there's a lack of awareness around trying to find the cause of those symptoms. So for example, if a team's hair is on fire because there's all these data issues, and you don't want your teams to be solving, all these problems, the question is how did it get so bad? Because a lot of times the focus is on putting out the fire, buying a new tool or something like this. And what you end up finding, because it's happened over and over and over again. In fact, I've never seen it not result in this, is more meetings, hiring more talent, and buying more technology. And none of those really work. Sometimes you do get nominal lifts, but then there's a cost of implementing these systems, and the root cause of all this disconnected understanding of how concepts fit at the strategic level and down to the data level, ultimately will it's like entropy. It's just going to create more and more chaos over time. So companies that think, oh, I'll hire a consulting firm and they're going to implement it, and in 2 years all my problems are going to go away. I can tell you they will not, unless this root problem is addressed. And this is preventable, and there are real lives negatively impacted. I've seen teams get blamed, people quit, like everyone's scared during when things are going bad and they start blaming each other. And sometimes it just feels so unnecessary, and I'm just really at a loss as to why we accept this kind of dynamic as the norm when we talk about data and business and strategy. So I've been lucky enough, it's been a dream of mine for years to get the opportunity to write a book. I'm writing with Juan Cruz Viotti, who he won multiple awards at Oxford, beating 40 years of data compression benchmarks. And this book is really all about how do we unify to align leadership and also to align our lower level data and code teams. And the outcome, why you should care about this, is because the best analogy I have is it's like giving your teams a compass, right? And if you don't have a shared compass before you invest money in building tools and technology, you're just optimizing the wrong things. Another analogy we might have is in music, a metronome, right? So imagine you're in a band and everyone's playing in a different tempo or key. It's going to sound like garbage. There needs to be a reference point where people can align around concepts. So I want to use an example. We'll pretend intelligence AI sells coffee. And let's look at how we might be able to do a very simple model. So the first thing we want to do, and you don't need to do it in a graph, you don't need to have animations. This is just something I'm working on that I think is fun. But you really just want to diagram, it can be in PowerPoint, it can be on a whiteboard. How does information flow, right? So you want to be capturing who, what, when, how. And what you're looking for, and most people don't want to talk about these more complex things, so I recommend you don't share this with the business folks, is you're looking for entropy and complexity and the frequency of signals being sent and how connected concepts are. And the reason is you want to find the most valuable concepts. Where's the biggest bang? So if a concept is needed everywhere and it has a high amount of frequency, then that has a lot of value. If it has a lot of entropy in it, because people have different definitions or ambiguity, if we don't want to use the word entropy, we know we have to focus on that. The second step is what we introduce in the book, is we call this concept first design. And the reason I like this approach, there are many approaches, this is just the one I'm recommending, is because it is very simple. You can do it in Excel or Google Sheets, and everyone has that. There's nothing complicated or technical here, but you're simply asking people, okay, describe to me this concept. Give it a definition. And on the top level, you see I have level 1, level 2, and then level 3. The reason you do this is because you want to get them to put it into a hierarchy. You want them to explain to you, how do they view these concepts and how do they fit together structurally? And after you do this, the very next step is to compare everyone's definitions. So you definitely want to do these one-on-one sessions, or like with only, a few people in a group, never more than 3, because the goal of doing concept first design is to have a way to capture how people see concepts and then see the differences in their concepts. So if you have someone from the marketing team, they would describe, oh, a product has this title and the currency and it has a design. And then you have someone from another team, they would design a product in a totally different structure. You want to be able to compare those two. And you also want to know where they intersect and what's important. And it is through the process of showing the differences between the other teams, you can start to get an alignment from the business folks, because this is simply just words here and kind of like a dictionary. You can get something that is easily translatable to something like JSON, right? So if you look at this, if I were to create a product object, curly bracket, and then I could have a key title, key description, key price, et cetera, et cetera. This is very easy to translate to JSON. And so this is kind of a very easy, it's like a trick on how to break things down into a spreadsheet form that can be used in JSON and that anyone can use. And it's eliminating a lot of the problems. One of the top problems data teams tell me that they have is that they're expected to, read the brain of some business person who's not explaining concepts to them, and they're supposed to translate it. And when they don't translate it properly, they get blamed for it. So the simplest way to prevent this problem is to make sure we work with those business folks and we get them to translate it for us, and we have to be their partners. We have to guide them through this design process. And then the third step, this is something we introduced in the book. We call this the 4 facets of a data product. Now, some of these words are very specific to industry terms, but we didn't want to use those industry terms because it starts World War III on LinkedIn every time I try and do that, right? So the word meaning here, some might call that semantics, some might not. But we didn't want to call it semantics because that already has such a huge amount of body of work, and there's all these careers, and the minute you start using the word semantics, everyone has an opinion. No one agrees what semantics means, which I think is hilarious. So let's go through these 4 facets. So context. So when a person has to use a data set and they just open a CSV file, it's completely lacking any context. And what we want to do to make it a data product is we want to have all of these 4 facets in a single object. Meaning, if you open a data file, you are guaranteed, if it is a data product, to have these 4 facets. You're guaranteed to have context. So you're not going to be opening up a file and just have a bunch of columns that you don't know what they mean, and then you have to go search for them. When we buy a bag of coffee, we go to the store, the coffee bag has a label, it has the country of origin, it has the nutritional information. So down here I put coffee as a product to give an analogy. Because when you go to the store, you don't just pick up raw beans with your hands and take it home. It has packaging. There are legal requirements in terms of putting the country of origin. There are systems like barcodes that give a unique identifier to that product. And so we really want to truly think about data in the same way as a product that is in a package that has a label. And that's the fundamental shift, I think, that we'd like to evangelize. And this is a very easy framework. There's nothing super complex here. Anyone can implement it in their own way. And actually, we're working on a JSON structure called JSON Unify, which basically is these 4 facets. And because it's meant to unify all these 4 facets into one. So instead of opening a CSV with nothing to know, you're gonna open a data object and be guaranteed to have all these. So for context, we want to know who created it, why they created it. Is there any lineage information, any governance information? Structure, we're using JSON schema. We really want to understand the structure of how the data is formed. And the meaning, the which, is really about when there's the word revenue, we want to have the word revenue have an explanation, a definition embedded with that data object. And then finally, at the very end, is the data, which we would call the coffee beans. So I'm sorry, I have my kids in the background. I'm sorry if there's a noise. All right, and I want to like also define for the group what do we mean when we say knowledge gaps, right? So I'm going to use an education perspective on defining knowledge gaps. I think it's kind of a common phrase, but it might be helpful to just talk about it. So if you want to teach a student the Pythagorean theorem, right, we would give assessments and then we would see what they are not able to answer. And those are the knowledge gaps. Now, when we talk about knowledge gaps, there are known knowledge gaps and unknown knowledge gaps. The known knowledge gaps are when you give a test and they can't answer, how to do something. The unknown knowledge gaps are like, what did we not test them on so we don't know? Or why don't they know how to solve something? And so it's the real, like the number one piece of advice I can give that I see just absolutely not happening in organizations is people don't like admitting what they don't know, especially the higher up you go in an organization, right? And culturally, I think it's really important to be able to expose what is not known and how that is impacting decision making. And I think people feel risk in having that exposed. But when you have at times literally tens and hundreds of millions of dollars of decisions investment going in for like large scale projects, and people are making decisions around data based on HIPPO or highest paid person's opinion, and this can be very irresponsible and very dangerous and has a just tremendous amount of risk. And being able to say, these are the things that we do not know how to do, and we're going to put together a map of everything we don't know, and the data we need to fill that knowledge gap is critical. And it is through the recognition of what we don't know and being able to eliminate errors, that is where learning happens. That is literally the definition of learning, is the reduction of errors over time. So if I had one piece of advice out of this whole entire presentation, it is to think about how knowledge gaps are connected to your strategy and to your data. The next piece of advice I have is slow to smooth, smooth to fast. This is a Navy SEALs expression. If you want to go fast, first go slow and smooth things out. And when you get things smooth, that will naturally become fast. So I'm a guitar player. Something that it took me a long time to learn was like I really get excited to play a song. I want to go fast. You have to truly have mastery over something. If you look at our little tagline at the bottom, we talk about data mastery. That means slowing down to the basics and really eliminating all errors. And only when the errors are eliminated, then do you add complexity or increase speed. And this is really hard in organizational cultures where people feel like their hair is on fire and there are objectives to achieve. The next piece of advice I have is around what I would call network-based value. So it has happened enough times now where I go into a client and they will say, this is our problem and this is the solution. And here's like $10 million is our budget, and make our problems go away. Well, unfortunately, it usually takes not too long to examine their systems to see going back to this problem with problems, the problem they're focused on may not be the most valuable problem. to solve. It may not be the most important problem to solve. It might just be trying to put out the symptoms. And when we talk about unifying or trying to use unifying, similar, separate than agile, but just like agile is a phrase, we would like to think about unifying and unify as a phrase as well. That what you're trying to do is look at your organization from a network perspective. Who are the people using the data? Why are they using the data? Connect those together. Understand how the knowledge and the data flows across your networks. Right? And then you want to figure out, well, what objectives will generate the most reward or the most amount of value. And the reason that this is important is, for example, cataloging all of the data your organization has is a lot of work and time. And there's a trade-off between cataloging your data that is necessary versus cataloging all of the data. And how do you pick where to focus? And this is not a trivial question. And this really goes back, I'm going to go back to this slide here. It goes back to this. Most organizations do not have a network-based map of how all their data connects, not from a data architecture level, but from the data all the way through operations and through decision-making. And creating a diagram where you can map all of these together is the easiest way to decide, in my opinion, or is the best way I've found. There might be others ways to value data, right? So as an example, if the CEO is like, oh, we've got this thing and it's $10 million and I need you to fix it, you go in, you analyze it, well, you find this other problem that maybe is not getting as much attention, but it's connected to 20 or 30 different systems, can total $50 million worth of problems, right? But unless someone puts together a map of how all these things connect, you don't actually know which data is most critical to the most amount of people with the most amount of frequency. And then you also see the word risk here and urgency. When you create a diagram of how information is connected, it is also important to understand, like, are there legal issues for which that make data more important? Or is there any urgency issue, any risks to consider?